In a forgotten part of the Cascades, there lived a man named Samuel Smith. He was 68 years old and had worked the land most of his life. His ranch sat in a narrow valley with no neighbors for miles. The nearest town was nearly 2 days away by mule. Samuel had lived alone since his wife passed 12 years earlier. They never had children. After she died, he stayed on the land, built fences, raised cattle, and kept to himself. He wasn't a talker, didn't take to strangers, and didn't go into town unless he had to. The cabin was small. 1 room, wood stove, tin roof. He built it with his own hands back in the early years. The barn stood across the pasture, weather-beaten but strong. Most days were the same: feed the animals, mend the fence, check the trap line. He ate what he grew and caught. He trusted no one but his old dog Scout, who followed him everywhere. Samuel didn't need much, and he didn't want much. Just quiet, wood to split, and his own land beneath his boots. But in the fall of 1897, things began to change. The woods around him, once still and familiar, began to feel different. The animals acted uneasy, the nights seemed longer. There were sounds in the trees he hadn't heard before. Samuel didn't believe in stories, but something was coming, and it was closer than he thought. By mid-October, the wind had changed. The cold came earlier than usual. The air was still, but the woods were not. Samuel Smith began noticing things that didn't sit right. At the far edge of his property, near the timberline, he found tracks in the mud. They weren't from any animal he knew, no hoof, no claw. These were bare feet, wide, flat, and nearly 18 inches long. Whatever made them walked upright and heavy. The ground was soft from rain, so the impressions were deep. He measured one beside his own boot. The toes were spread, no shoes. No human could have left them, not in that cold, and not way out there. A few days later, fence posts were pulled up, not knocked over, lifted straight out of the ground, with no sign of splintering. One was laid neatly beside the fence line. Samuel knew bears didn't do that, and no man would go to that trouble, without reason. His mule refused to go near the north pasture, ears pinned back, eyes wide. Scout, his dog, began growling at the woods in the evening. Not barking, just a low, steady growl, eyes fixed on nothing Samuel could see. Then came the sound. Late at night, Samuel would hear a knocking, deep in the trees. Not branches in the wind. This was patterned, like 2 thick logs being struck together. Once, then again, and then silence. Some nights, a long, low howl rolled down from the ridge, too deep to be a wolf, too steady to be a cougar. It didn't rise or fall like an animal cry. It held. One note, mournful and strange. Samuel had lived in that valley over 30 years. He knew every sound it made. But this was something else. And whatever it was getting closer. The storm rolled in fast that evening. The sky turned black just after sundown. The wind cut low through the valley and howled through the pine tops like a freight train. Rain came down hard, thick sheets pounding the roof, soaking the ground in minutes. Samuel Smith was finishing up in the shed when he heard it. A loud knock from the barn wall. Not a branch. Not thunder. A solid thump, like a fist against timber. He froze, hands still on the hay bale. It came again. Thump. Then again. 3 knocks, even, spaced out, deliberate. Samuel grabbed his lantern and woodsman's axe, opened the cabin door, and stepped out into the storm. Wind nearly took his hat off. Scout didn't follow. The dog stayed back, low to the floor, ears flat. The barn stood about 30 yards from the house. Lantern light showed part of it, but not all. Samuel moved closer, boots sinking into the mud. As he rounded the corner of the barn, he stopped cold. There, just past the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was huge, tall as the barn door, broad in the shoulders, covered in soaked dark hair. Water ran off its back. Arms hung low. It didn't move, didn't blink. It wasn't alone. Behind it stood several more shapes, just barely visible, hunched, still. The wind whipped around them, but they didn't flinch. One leaned on another, clearly injured, one arm tucked in. None of them made a sound. They didn't advance. They didn't growl or threaten. They stood quietly, eyes fixed ahead, as if waiting for something. Samuel didn't raise the axe. He didn't yell. He just stood there, watching. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he stepped back, turned without a word, and walked to the barn door. He opened it wide, pulled dry hay from the stack and laid it out in the corner. He added an old wool blanket, then set down a bucket of apples and oats. Without looking back, he walked to his cabin, set the lantern down, and closed the door. Later that night, between lightning flashes, he looked out the window. The barn door was closed. Samuel Smith didn't say a word. He didn't ask what they were or what they wanted. He just moved with purpose. He stepped into the barn, grabbed a few armfuls of dry hay, and spread it in the corner, away from the draft near the doors. He took 2 wool blankets from a storage chest near the tack wall, old, worn, but still good enough to hold warmth. He set them down on top of the hay. Next, he filled a wooden bucket with chopped apples, oats, and dried corn, meant for the mule. He placed it just inside the open doorway. He left a second bucket of water nearby. He didn't look out toward the creatures. He didn't need to. He could feel their presence at the edge of the rain. Then Samuel stepped away. He didn't close the barn door. He didn't wave them in. He just walked slowly back to the cabin, soaked to the bone, and left the lantern lit on the porch. He shut the cabin door behind him and knelt down by the stove to dry off. Scout, his old dog, stayed curled near his chair, eyes wide, ears raised. But the dog didn't growl, didn't bark, just watched the door. Later that night, long after the rain had eased, Samuel looked through the window. The barn door was closed. Whatever they were, they had gone inside. The pasture was quiet. The woods were still. Nothing howled. Nothing moved. And for the first time in days, the valley felt calm. The visits continued. For the next several nights, Samuel Smith saw the figures return. Sometimes all of them, sometimes only 2 or 3. They always came after dark. They never approached the cabin. They went straight to the barn, quiet and steady. They used the hay. They rested in the corner where he had laid the blankets. By first light they were gone. Nothing was damaged. Tools were untouched. Feed barrels weren't spilled. They didn't act like animals. They acted like something that understood how to share space. On the 4th morning, Samuel stepped out to check the cattle. That's when he saw the fence near the west pasture had been repaired. The section that had sagged for weeks now stood upright. But it hadn't been fixed with boards or nails. Instead, someone had woven long branches between the old posts, tight like a basket, packed with pine and moss. It would hold through the winter. Another day, he walked the trail toward the creek and noticed the brush had been cleared. Not trampled, but moved aside. Limbs were stacked off to the side, and a path had been opened straight to the water. There were no footprints, just signs of work, done at night, done in silence. The livestock remained calm, the mules stopped braying at shadows. Scout didn't bark anymore, just watched the barn each night, and then went to sleep. They never came to the cabin, never tried the door, never left a mark on the porch. Samuel didn't try to speak to them. He didn't ask questions. He just kept the barn ready, the buckets full and the blankets dry. Whatever they were, they had chosen to stay clear and quiet. And in return, he did the same. They came back one night, but not like before. The wind was sharp, and the sky held no stars. Around midnight, Samuel Smith heard movement in the yard. Not slow, not careful, rushed. He stepped onto the porch with his lantern. The barn door creaked open, then shut again fast. He crossed the yard, lantern held low. The light caught shapes through the slats. Dark forms, shifting, huddled tight. Breathing hard, one leaned back against the far wall, shoulders rising and falling. Then Samuel saw it. One of the smaller ones, no taller than a man, had long claw marks across its side. The wounds were fresh, torn through hair and skin. One of the larger figures crouched beside it, blocking the view from the open door. They were being chased, or had been. Samuel said nothing. Scout stood at the edge of the porch, barked once, then lowered his head and walked back inside. Samuel didn't need to be told what to do. He took the lantern and walked to the barn's front post. He hung it high, just above the door. A light to say they were welcome, no threat, no fear. Then he returned to his cabin and closed the door. Set his axe beside the chair. Sat down by the fire. Listened. No more barking, no howls, no movement in the woods. The wind picked up, but the valley stayed quiet. Whatever had chased them was gone now, and Samuel knew they wouldn't stay much longer. 2 more nights passed. The group stayed in the barn both nights. Samuel could hear their quiet movements from the cabin, the shifting of weight on old floorboards, the soft scrape of straw. Nothing more. They didn't come out during the day. They didn't make a sound once the sun was up. Just as before, they arrived in the dark and disappeared before dawn. On the 3rd morning, everything was quiet. No shapes at the barn, no breathing behind the walls, no movement in the pasture. Samuel stepped outside. The barn door stood open. Inside, the hay had been pressed down in the corners, but nothing was disturbed. Blankets still in place, feed buckets empty, set aside. There were no fresh tracks in the yard, not in the dirt, not in the wet grass. They were gone. Samuel turned toward the cabin and stopped. At the foot of the steps, placed carefully on the flat stone landing, was a small circle of river rocks. Each stone smoothed and grey, stacked 3 layers high, in a ring no wider than a man's hat. Not random, not weather-made. It was a parting sign. He walked out to the edge of the trees and saw more. The underbrush was cleared. Limbs, sticks and debris had been dragged to the side. A clean trail now led from the barn to the forest. Straight, narrow and quiet. Samuel stood for a while, staring into the trees. They had left the same way they came, with no sound, no trouble, and no trace. Except for that small circle of stone, and the silence they left behind. Samuel Smith never told the townsfolk what happened that fall. He kept to himself, just like always. Rode into town when he needed supplies, nodded politely, and rode back before nightfall. Folks knew he was quiet, and they left him be. He never spoke of the creatures, never mentioned the nights in the barn. Not once. Only one person ever heard the story. Years later, in the spring of 1905, a traveling doctor came through the valley. Samuel had taken a fall and cracked his leg bad. The doctor stayed 2 nights at the cabin, tending to him. On the 2nd night, with the fire low and the wind scratching at the windows, Samuel told him. Not the whole thing, just the part that mattered. He said they weren't monsters, just forest folk. Quiet, careful. They needed a roof. I had one. That was all. After that fall in 1897, Samuel kept the barn ready. Every October, before the first frost, he laid out a blanket, a few apples, and a full bucket of water. Left the door unlatched. Some years, the items were gone by morning. Some years, they stayed until the snow came. But the fence lines were always tight by winter, loose rails fixed, posts reinforced. And somehow, without him chopping more than usual, the firewood stack by the shed never ran low. Samuel lived out his days quiet and steady, just the way he liked. He never saw them again. But every fall, he waited. Just in case.